Welcome back to yet another cracking edition of the Matt Brown Show. This edition of the show is proudly brought to you by Flownesys. And with me on the line from the bright lights of Cape Town, where I was born, is none other than the founder and CEO of Flownesys. His name is Ludwig May. Ludwig, welcome to the show.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much. Really appreciate being here with the listeners.
No, man, it's all good, brother. So listen, kick us off with the elevator pitch. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to.
I've been about 20 years in the fast-moving consumer goods business, predominantly focused on supply chain manufacturing, but then also moving into auditing, so looking at how processes fail, what are the key reasons that they fail, how do we fix them, and how do we ensure that we fix them sustainably so that they don't continue to fail. So that's been about 20 years of playing around in that sphere. But in the last 2 years, I also embarked on an executive MBA at the University of Cape Town. So that's been quite a rewarding experience, both in terms of personal growth, which I focus on predominantly, as well as understanding why organizations fail, how to intervene, where to intervene, and then also to understand what are the potential implications of intervening before you do it, so that you either accept that risk or you mitigate it before the time.
So what's your intention then behind Flownesys? What are you guys trying to solve there for people?
Perfect. So Flownesys originally comes from the concept of phronesis. So phronesis is in the old Greek philosophy. It speaks to practical wisdom. So practical wisdom rather than just theoretical wisdom. So we've kind of used that term, but just changed it into flow, which I'm quite passionate about. Because with flow, it's also about doing things in alignment in an easy, simplistic way, rather than focusing on the judgment. So when one is typically in flow, you're able to produce results 500% more effectively than if you're out of flow. So having studied that whilst doing my MBA, I'm quite passionate about the concept of flow and how we able to achieve more with less in a quicker time.
So what is flow? That's come up a lot in my life. It's like, you got to find your flow. So what is flow as you see it?
The godfather of flow is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he did the study to look at different people in different work and how they're actually able to achieve more with less. So we have different terms for the concept of flow. When you speak to runners, they'll speak about being in the zone. When you speak to boxers, they'll speak about being in the pocket. So it's that space that you're in where, time doesn't matter. It either shortens or it lengthens, and you have no real perspective of it. And typically flow is separated into three forms: focus flow, creative flow, and then recovery flow. So if you want the tsunami of focus flow, you also need to ensure that you have the tsunami of recovery flow in order to support that. And there are different triggers within flow in order to get you in that space. So I've been quite passionate about using those triggers in order to push me, getting clarity on whether I'm doing focus flow or whether I'm doing creative flow, because you need different times for the different instances. And then also ensuring that I do recovery flow, utilizing yoga nidra, which is also no sleep, deep rest.
So how does this all come together? Like when you talk about flow and the different types of flow, which I think is interesting as a concept, but very few people actually find flow. Do you know what I mean? So what's your intention behind all of this? I mean, have you developed a particular model that entrepreneurs or business leaders can use to amplify their influence? Like, what's the intention behind all of this?
Perfect. So the intention out of studying flow since the start of my studies, particularly, I've taken time to reflect on what works, what doesn't work. And as I went through that journey of doing that, I created a model which I call the sustainable growth model. It's come, I was actually developing it before I thought I was developing it. So as I look back 9 months earlier, I was actually utilizing some of those tools and refining them in order to get to this model, which assist people not just in surviving, but also in thriving. So, depending on if you have an urgency and emergency, something you need to address right now, you can use the model. And I've used that in certain cases myself. And similarly, if you want to look over a longer time frame, you can also ensure that you utilize it in order to achieve more, utilizing less.
So, sustainable growth model. It sounds like everyone's talking about sustainability these days, aren't they? It's like, you're going to buy not just any shoe, you're going to buy the shoe that's recyclable or what have you. But yet, what's really interesting for me to observe is that sustainability is nice to set as an intention, but in many cases, especially in the private sector, sustainability is like lip service. It's not like they're saying they're sustainable, but they're not really adopting sustainable growth practices or just sustainable practices in the supply chain or whatever the case is. So when you say that it's a sustainable growth model, what does that word sustainable actually mean? Is it, and in the context of what? Like, what is the sustainable growth model actually there to do for people, and how sustainable actually is it?
Sustainability element looks at, are you doing things within capability? So if you're playing the infinite game rather than just the finite game, you're actually focusing on this needs to be sustainable over time. And I've done quite a bit of support for projects. And typically executives come in there, they say, here's a project, you need to finish it in 6 months, right? And you ask the question based on what? It's based on there being 12 people in place in order to execute this project. If you look at what's happening at the moment, you've got 3 people. You know that utilizing your people's practices, it's going to take 3 months to get 3 people and another 3 months to get the rest of them. So realistically, you're going to burn out people if you actually stick to a time frame. So when you look into the capability space, you see what can we do given what we have, given what we need in order to execute the rest, and how realistic is it actually to do that without burning out our people? Because if we burn out our people, they won't be able to execute and won't be able to execute effectively. So the capability element takes into account what's our objective, what can we do realistically, and then to redefine our goals based on those objectives and the capabilities. And again, I look at the start of my program in the executive MBA. Initially, as I looked at it in terms of my commitment, I wanted to do 35 hours per week. What I realized is, given the fact that I was quite passionate about salsa and used to dance salsa about 5 days per week, realistically, I could only do 10 hours. Now it wasn't feasible to do a full-time job, to do 35 hours, to do the salsa, and to be able to do everything. So I said, right, what's my objectives? And my objectives for the next 2 years is to focus on the executive MBA. In terms of that, what needs to move? So given the capabilities, what is realistic, right? There's a time constraint here, which means I can't do what I want to, and therefore I need to eliminate something in order to be able to do it. And once I made that decision, it was simple. So the structure of the SGM gave me a structure to provide clarity, one that I was going to burn myself out if I wanted to do all of these things. So I needed to make some trade-offs and decide what is the most important objective I wanted to achieve. And based on that, to be able to then redefine my goals within that time period to be able to achieve them realistically.
It's a really powerful idea, this, right? Burnout. So we're like, it's now, what is it, the 28th of December. So I've really enjoyed the last 48 hours. You know what I mean? Like having not to deal with people and the typical work grind and things like that. And I think it's really interesting in the context of entrepreneurship and business leadership, especially this idea of burnout, because I think ambition's like a double-edged sword. Like if you get there, at what cost? Do you see? And to your point around these constraints, and this is why that sustainability growth model is so important, is because what I'm hearing is it actually helps you to understand what is really possible without pushing the levels or the limits so far that you wind up getting what you want at the cost of everything else. And I think this idea of success has changed, hasn't it? It used to be about, how much money can you make and how fast can you make it. Everybody wants to be a billionaire at 30, right? That's the definition of success, evidently. But I think today it's changed somewhat, in the sense that now success is about having this financial freedom, but also having the ability to not lose yourself in that pursuit, and having the ability to have a successful marriage while also generating wealth. It's the ability to have, a successful relationship with your children without, and with the success of the business. And I think this idea has changed somewhat. So is that kind of up the wheelhouse of what the intention behind the sustainability growth model is?
Correct, definitely. So it's about making sure that what you want to achieve is realistic. And I mean, you speak, Matt, in one of your previous episodes about being able to say no. The reality is we only have 24 hours in a day. You need to define what is important to you. Once you've defined what's important to you, you then look at what is your capability, and then you're able to quite clearly say no because it doesn't work. It cannot fit into your model. Yeah. The reality is, if you don't want to live till 65 and then die soon after retiring because of burnout, you need to say what is realistic. And what I found is that we often get sidetracked by things which are unimportant. We get stressed out by things which are unimportant, which either we don't need to do or we don't need to do right now. So we find that we're trying to do everything for everyone, and we're getting pulled into different directions without actually being able to enjoy life as we go through it.
Hmm.
And I found that in my own life. So as I was able to cut certain parts out and say, this is the priority right now, it actually gave me greater joy, greater satisfaction, because I could be fully in each moment without thinking I have 8 other things that I need to do.
Hmm.
And I'm sitting and having coffee with a friend, but I'm not fully there, right? Because I'm still thinking that I need to rush to do X and Y and Z. And through going through the model, I realized the X, the Y, the Z doesn't actually need to happen, or
Hmm.
doesn't need to happen by me, or doesn't need to happen by me right now.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this idea of to-do lists. Let me write a list of things to do. I actually
Mhm.
think it's that whole idea again comes from, like, the 1960s, when you had to make a shopping list. You know what I mean? When you lived on a farm and you had to, like, travel long ways to get access to any kind of food stuff. But yet that idea is translated over into the business world, essentially, right? In the sense of, you have to make a list of things you need to do. But I think the more that I make this list of things that I need to do, the more anxiety I get about why I haven't done those things. And then I'm also not thinking about that list of things in a context where it's like, well, how much can I do?
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? And I think it's
Yeah.
such a powerful perspective shift to think about, well, what not only should you do,
Mhm.
but how much can I do?
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? Without burning myself out in the process. What are your thoughts on to-do lists?
Yep. So I think to-do lists are good in order to help us understand what we need to do. However, they need to be based on our goals, which should be aligned with our objectives. So often we have things on those to-do lists where 70% of them can be done by other people. And I give the example, you potentially a parent and you're earning quite a decent salary. You then find that you're utilizing a lot of time because you're also an entrepreneur by driving your kids to their various activities. But you need to make the decision, is that quality time with my kid, which is valuable? Or is that actually not quality time because I'm stressed out because I'm running between things and having to do these different tasks? And if it's quality time, ensure that it's in your diary. If it's not quality time, How about getting a who to do those activities? Now, ideally, you want a trustable who you know is going to do the job, but it's about clarifying what is important, at what cost. Am I willing to spend that? Or is there something else that can actually do this instead of me?
So let's change gears and talk about a little bit more around this SGM model of yours. So how does the SGM adapt to individuals at different stages and with varying goals? Because like you described, you might have kids, but oftentimes you don't. And as you
Mhm.
know, once you have kids, the wheels come off and all the priorities change. You have way less time than you ever had before, and all you were wishing for was when you could go back into your 20s. So, so how does your SG, I mean, obviously frameworks are there to be fluid, right? But they're to construct thinking as an example. So how does it adapt? I mean, if you're a single solopreneur, 26-year-old versus a 45-year-old married with two kids entrepreneur, like how does the model adapt?
So, I mean, the start of the model was everyone has goals and they measure achievement against that goals. Your goal might be simple. I need to get milk. I need to get Coca Cola. I need to get something from the shop. So you have your goal and you measure whether you achieved it. You overcome some constraints on your way to achieving that. I need to get a vehicle. I need to get it picked up, etc., etc. So that's the first basic level of the sustainable growth model. The additional step is then ideally to have that goal aligned to a bigger objective. So you have that objective, you have that goal, and you have the measure. But what I found was that I had the objective, I had the goal, but then I wasn't achieving it, which then assisted me in inserting the capability. So you go from objective to capability and then define the goals based on those two. So, depending on what individuals want to do, they can either just stick to goals and measures by overcoming the constraints, or the other part which I realized was we also don't use our amplifiers sufficiently. So we have accelerators that would potentially get us to achieve our goals easier, but we don't always think about it. And I had the case this afternoon with a mate of mine where we were at an event and she had forgotten an item. So she had this goal, I need to get this item. She was going to measure it. She had to overcome this constraint. So she was running the event. She needed to get this additional item. And she was going through, okay, I need to get my car. I need to get everyone to move out. I need to go and purchase this. What am I creating additional challenges because who's going to look after the rest of the guests? And then because I had spoken to her about the model earlier, she picked up the phone and she phoned one of the friends and said, can't you pick this up on the way to the event? Now it's simple, it's not complicated, but you've actually taken out all the challenges of the constraint out of the equation because you don't need to think about the car, you don't need to get everyone to move out. Yes, you don't even need to worry about money because someone else is potentially going to pay for this. So there are so many potential accelerators which we can use, right? We're applying for a job at a certain institution. We have four mates of ours who works there, but we don't want to ask them for assistance. Why not? What do we have to lose? Yeah. We want to start a podcast, right? Why don't we utilize accelerators, those who have gone before us, who have learned the hard lessons over 10 years or so, and ask them to actually assist us in getting where we need to? Now, there might be a cost, but that cost is probably much less than the cost of you learning the lessons on your own. So the SGM provides the structure for actually assisting us in gaining clarity. And by gaining that clarity, it gives us decisiveness to move forward and to move forward almost with energy, which we may not have done. I mean, if you have someone who's learned the ropes of creating a certain business and they give you guidance through mentorship of how to approach things going forward, it gives you greater impetus to actually just drive forward much faster. Yeah.
Mm. Yep. It's interesting what you're describing, right? Because I think sometimes we get stuck. It's like we know we need to go from A to B. We want to make $1 million this year. Maybe like you were describing, you want to start a podcast, but then you're like, there's these roadblocks that we put in front of ourselves. Like you're saying, the constraints. So those things for me are roadblocks. Like, why can't I get to that goal or that objective? And so what we do then is we start focusing on the roadblocks, and we don't start focusing on the right things that will get us clarity. All right. Or in other words, we don't focus on the perspective that we need to feel like we can achieve the thing that we want to achieve in the timeline that we want to achieve. Like you said, with the podcasting thing, and I agree with you. It's like, go to someone that's already walked the journey, like go rather than try and figure that shit out all on your own. But that word accelerator, it's used a lot here in the US as an example, especially in the startup space. There's a accelerator for pretty much every possible thing you can imagine. But I'm curious, just to kind of bring this model to life a little bit more. If you're catching this on the podcast, we are showing visual aids on the YouTube channel. So go head over there. You can actually see this model and how it all comes together. So in your personal experience, though, Ludwig, how have you personally used accelerators to enhance your own capabilities and achieve your own goals more effectively?
Yep. So the one space was, as part of my studies, some of the subjects were quite technical. So accountancy, finance, areas which for me are a bit overwhelming. And to the point which you made earlier, within the constraints, we often find that we are overwhelmed by the emotion. And we're almost overwhelmed by, where do we start to make sense out of all of this? And reflecting on when I was a student at high school, I used to similarly struggle with accountancy. And I was trying to assist one of my friends with finding someone to tutor their daughter. And as I was doing this, I found the person, got a link, etc. And then I was like, dude, but what's wrong with you getting a tutor? Right? Not to do the work for you, but to explain the concepts, because within the class, there are people with different levels of understanding, and the lecturer obviously focused on that. But there's nothing wrong at my age with still getting a tutor in order to guide me through. So I utilized that tutor. It was quite strange because at the time I was traveling. The tutor could only see me at 6 o'clock South Africa time, which was 4 o'clock UK time. And we made the time then in order to see each other for about 10 days in order for me to get guidance on how to move forward.
It's really interesting, right? This model and how it really works with a number of sort of drivers that help you to create value and or intentionality behind what you're trying to achieve, whether it's tutoring or growing or scaling a business or whatever the case is. I'm curious to unpack a little bit more around this. So how has aligning your objectives and goals through the SGM model led to your ability to unlock a greater sense of clarity around purpose? And I'm curious to understand how that's led to transformative growth in your own life.
So the one part was, as I started off the beginning of this year, I decided objectives are family, finance, and fitness. So in terms of finance, it was short term, the work which I was doing as a contractor for various organizations, and in the long term, the executive MBA. So in that space, it was simple. If anything gets in the way, right, and conflicts in terms of time with those goals, it gets moved out. So if a friend has an event and it's going to take hours, 8 hours, and it's going to get stuck into my time, which I've dedicated to my studies, it moves out. Yeah. And over time, friends understood it. And I was quite clear also on what my objectives were. They understood the time frame and what we were going to achieve by going through. Also, because I created a clear priority between family, finance, and fitness, it made things easier. So if a friend wanted me to go to an activity and it interfered with my financial goals being work and studies, it would move out. If my family required me unexpectedly due to a certain situation like moving and someone dropped them and therefore they needed my assistance because that was the number one priority. It was simple. So it makes the decision making process so much easier.
Hmm.
Yeah. Whereas
Yeah.
previously you'd be, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I? It makes it simple. You go through and you go through your model and it's decided. And once you make that decision, you can move forward. And once those around you understand what your decision making process is, they also actually support you in doing it. The other part of your question was around purpose. So, as I was moving through the mindfulness practices, one of the things that emerged was my purpose, which I articulate as the search for truth underpinned by mastery. Once and even though I kind of created it in my mind, articulated it, I was still testing it out. And I've now clarified it as search for truth underpinned by mastery. And that explains why I've done so many things that I've done in my life, why I used to explore and, do various experiments in order to see different things. It helps me understand why I'm a good auditor. It because I'm searching for truth. It helps me understand why if I someone tells me something that doesn't completely make sense, I would go and do the research in order to understand. But I also understood that my purpose is search for truth, and I also search for my own truth. So it clarified to me also why I trained as a therapist, because part of the training as a therapist was trying to find my own truth. I mean, it also gave me clarity because in service, and my mother's a social worker, so she works in and does soup kitchens and welfare for elderly and children. And for some reason, that never really resonated with me. And I was like, am I a bad person? Am I not charitable? Do I not consider others? But the reality is, so often your service is aligned to your purpose. So, what I found is that my purpose is search for truth and searching for my truth. But I also assist people with searching for truth and searching for their truth. So, similarly, as I trained to be a therapist and got value out of that, I was also training as a therapist in order to assist others with searching for their truth. So, once you start finding what your purpose is, it actually just elevates what you do.
Hmm.
So, I started getting sense in terms of the amount of work that I was putting into my studies was because of the search for truth underpinned by mastery. It also explained to me, for example, in certain assignments, I mean, I recall one of the assignments where we had to define, I think, 5 variables, and I defined 26 of them. And it wasn't because I was trying to achieve anything. It's just it didn't make sense to me to not define all 26. Because if I did not define all 26, I not just didn't search for the truth, but I wasn't telling the truth. It's as an example, if you were telling a story about the left eye, you need to tell a story about the right eye. Then you need to include the eyelashes, the eyebrows, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the tongue. But then because you're going to the senses, also need to include the hands. So, in order to tell the full story so that the reader actually understands it, you needed to go through all of that. So, similarly, I could not just stop at the 5. I needed to do the 26 in order to actually tell the story. So, you start seeing sense in how you've done what you've done and why you've done what you've done. Once you start getting clarity on purpose, and I'm still trying to find a definitive mechanism for people to find purpose. I mean, I've done it through a process of mindfulness and practicing and reflection in order to get there. And one day it just emerged, and I tested it and I tested it against different elements in order to get more understanding. But I'd like to find a a way to almost short circuit how we clarify our purpose, because once you get there, everything else just seems to fall into place.
Mm.
You will find that you get resources, you get more clarity on your objectives, and you just start running at speeds which you may not have done before. Sorry, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. You did. I think the purpose thing is important, right? Because, and I think what I'm hearing is you've already figured it out. You've already figured out the mechanism, and you said it before. You said your purpose is often linked to your service. That's the mechanic. That's what service are you providing to others. That's what influence is. It's about how are you making a difference? How are you contributing to the world and society and your customers and your family or whatever in a way that's all purpose, dude. And I know, and I also don't think you find it. You create it. You don't find service. Do you know what I mean? Like you create
Mhm.
service. You're like, cool.
Mhm.
Well, that sucks for that person. I'm going to go and solve it for that person.
Yeah.
And that's a similar thing for me in the Matt Brown show.
Yeah.
Like my dad, I read about this in my first book, but he was basically talking about, he said to me one day, I was a youngster, like I did something really naughty and I thought I was going to get the life beaten out of me. And he basically he said to me, one day God will judge you and, you need to have a very good answer about what the purpose of your life was. Right. And then for the next like 30 years, that fucked me up completely because I was like, oh, I have to go find it somewhere. Where is it? Is it lying? Is it behind the door? Is it underneath the desk? Where is it? Where do I find my purpose? And then the moment I realized that, through the show, even like you don't find your purpose, you create it. Purpose
Yeah.
is a proactive thing.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it would be reactive. That's not purpose,
Mhm.
right? That's
Mhm.
shit. That's just trying to survive and trying to figure
Yep.
out what you're about.
Yep.
But to your point, I love that idea. Like your purpose is always linked to your service. I
Yep.
think that's the mechanic because it can be as big or as contextually relevant to so many different life stages, to so many different types of businesses, those who are solopreneurs, scalepreneurs, whatever, or investors, right? Like it's all about the service you're providing. That's your
Yeah.
purpose.
Yeah. And I mean, added to that, I think also, what's the thing that you get passionate about, that you get energized by? You know what? If someone says something, what's the thing that makes you run at speed in order to solve that thing? Yeah,
Mm.
and that would often be linked to your purpose.
And I think it's an ambition to work towards, right? And I guess now when you're providing that service, then it's kind of like, well, going back to the SGM model, it's kind of like, well, how do I remove constraints or take a constraint and turn that into an accelerator so I can bring that purpose to life,
Yep.
right? And so we all have these roadblocks, we all have these constraints. Can you give an example of how your SGM model has transformed a constraint into an accelerator?
So I also call the constraints and the accelerators snakes and ladders. So 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 just imagine you've got a project that you want to drive, and you've got two VPs that are for your project and two vice presidents that are against it. So the vice presidents who are for it might lift you two levels. The vice presidents against it might drop you two levels. So here's your ladders, and here are your snakes. So often, so essentially, accelerators and constraints are the two different sides of the same coin. I could have just used the accelerators, so what will allow me to achieve the purpose easier. But I kept both because it helps you focus on both elements. And I think different people need the support in looking at the different sides. So often we look at the accelerators and we say these two vice presidents are in favor, brilliant. But what if we addressed one of the vice presidents who were against it? And we try to understand what their reservations are. And they might come back and say, you're going to take some of our staff, and therefore I'm not for this project. Once you start actually highlighting to them that you're going to make them 3 times more efficient as a result of this project, they won't just lift you 2 levels. They'll probably lift you 10 levels. Because the mere fact that someone who was against something has actually changed would probably create an even greater impetus. So
Mm.
again, that concept of snakes and ladders, and changing a snake into a ladder that actually becomes a multiplier.
Mm.
Again, I mean, if we look at the example of this afternoon with my mate, there were constraints. She didn't have the necessary item which she wanted. But we cut out the constraints by actually just using an amplifier. And one of the, I mean, for the audience, one of the easiest accelerators is to find a who can do their task better, easier, quicker, at less cost than you.
That's a whole business on its own, dude. If I don't save you 30% in your operating costs in the next 12 months, you don't pay me a cent.
Right?
Right, because to your point, I mean, think about all the complexity, especially in a business at some kind of scale, right? Where you have hundreds of people, process, policy systems, things like that. Think about all the friction that
Yeah.
happens in that space, right? To your point. And so if you're able to, with your SGM model, identify what are these constraints, transform them into accelerators, you're just creating more momentum at speed at a fraction of the cost. And I think that, especially in the business case or the business context, is really, really, really valuable. Just a question on expectations. So, we spoke about purpose and SGM and accelerators, constraints, all this kind of stuff. But expectations are really an inherent part of life. It's like your
Yeah.
happiness equals reality minus expectations. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious to understand with that concept, right, thwarted
Mm.
expectations
Yeah.
being central to your thesis,
Yeah.
how might this SGM model, as an example, manage or leverage these unexpected outcomes?
Yeah. So I think there's a few elements to it. So out of utilizing the SGM and seeing that I wasn't realizing my goals. So when I went through my goals and my measurement and my reflection, I found that I had what is called thwarted expectations. So not realizing. Through going through that reflection and learning loop, you actually then learn to augment that into either your objectives or your capabilities in order to articulate your goals more clearly so that you can achieve it. Um, so those were the key parts. But this concept of thwarted expectations is actually quite interesting, and one of the elements that come through quite strongly. I mean, I'm still busy with the thesis. Is that as you gain more experience, you actually start having less emotional turmoil as a result of thwarted expectations.
Yeah, and that's a skill on its own, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the magic happens where you're actually able to expedite gaining that experience.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
there are certain mechanisms in order to facilitate it. But I mean, also getting to a point which you made earlier, Matt, I mean, my vision would actually be to implement the sustainable growth model. And you can do it in any system. You can do it in your life. Yeah. And just choose which elements you want to use. Or you could actually apply it in a business. And I would love to see an organization utilizing the SGM and making it part of their vocabulary,
Mm.
such that you have a situation where the proverbial popo hits the fan, and everyone goes into this massive war room in order to address things. And everyone's learned the lingo, and people make plans and they go and they do everything. And everyone says, right, we're all on track, we're all gonna do. And everyone's about to go out, and this junior says, can we clarify our constraints? What accelerators are we using? And then you'll see these big men huffing and puffing and saying, that's nonsense. And then they say, wait, what's our constraint?
Yeah.
What accelerators are we using? Yeah. And the entire room, ideally going back to the planning phase and saying, guys, wait, we've adopted this as a philosophy in our organization.
Mm.
Let's stop, take a moment to think and articulate what's the constraint. Because what I find quite often is we confuse the constraint. We think the constraint is cost when it's not cost. It's something else. It could be time.
Hmm.
Yeah, and because we're addressing the incorrect element, we're not achieving what we can in focusing on the element which we need to resolve. So again, it gives us the clarity to be able to drive things forward in a way that aligns with our objectives and our goals.
Mhm. Yeah, I had Alexander Osterwalder on the show not too long ago. He created the business model canvas. It's a similar
Yeah.
thing, isn't it? If people wanted a reference to, like, well, how do you design a business model? Well, you would use that. In your case, it's about using the similar canvas, right? The SGM canvas or model to effectively help and align teams internally
Yeah.
using a similar vocabulary to talk about, well, what are the constraints actually with this product launch? What are the
Yeah.
accelerators? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
then aligning everybody culturally around that strategy. And I think that's
Yeah.
really what I'm hearing as being like a key thing in terms of the value of what you've built.
Yeah. And I mean adding on it, and then you've got, I think, additional tools which you just flex on top of this model. So the
Mm-hmm.
one tool is utilizing 10x and saying, what if we stayed as we are and we create 10 times the impact?
Mm.
What
So
if we
Ludwig,
kept it
yeah, go ahead.
and we did a tenth of the cost? So what often happens in projects, we actually get distracted by the elements which are not important. When we start saying, let's reduce this to 10% of the cost, we then find that all of the five functionalities we have are not really important. One of them is important and another part of another one. But we focus all our energy on the other three parts that are not material. So by utilizing elements like that, you're able to then even tweak what is really important, what do we need to focus on, and then
Mm.
you might scale it back to a 4x where you say these are the areas that we're actually going to focus on, these other parts are not material, they could get delayed.
It's amazing, man. Ludwig, let's wrap this up. Why do you do what you do? Like, why are you doing this?
Dude, I'm passionate about people living fulfilled lives, right? People flourishing. There are too many people in this world. I mean, and it's choices, and sometimes we are given a difficult deck of cards, right? There are people who are surviving. And that's why I wanted to address both parts, survival and thriving.
Mm.
Um, so that people can really live fulfilled lives. We don't need to live as difficult as we do.
Mm.
Yes. There's other paths that make life simpler, easier for all of us if we choose to do it. But I mean, it's a choice coupled with being given the tools in order to support that. So that's my key driver.
Mhm. Ludwig, amazing, man. I love the work, I love the thinking, and most importantly, I love the impact that you're trying to have in the world. I think it's super exciting. And just wanted to say, wish you and the Flownesys team all the very best for 2024 and beyond.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Matt. All the best to you too.
Everybody else, we'll see you again soon. Ciao for now.